Well, do you guys want to get started tonight? Sweet. So appreciate everybody joining in tonight. I think what we'll do is, Ryan, you'll finish up the conversation of functions that we didn't get to last time. And then what time we have left, if Kevin, if you wouldn't mind starting talking about modules. After I read modules, I was like, this is a lot of information packed into one chapter. So it will probably extend. Yeah. So it'll probably extend into multiple sessions. So
yeah. I've read that chapter multiple times and it's finally just starting to sink in.
I would agree with that. Like, it's one of I read first time and I was like, nothing. So yeah. So if Kevin, if you wouldn't mind taking the second part of this after Ryan gets done, and then whatever we have left, we can figure out for the other sessions and stuff. So I really appreciate you guys taking on the presentation duties. So with that, I'll just mute myself and let Ryan kick us off.
That's great. So team, Connor, you missed out on a eventful presentation last week. I was having some power issues / battery dying and finishing the presentation on my phone. So what I'm going to do today is just cover the remaining topics of what we didn't cover last week. And ultimately, how do I get this thing out of the way? I'll move that over here. Increase font size and make it a little easier to see the too large. Okay, so functions as a service are obviously, we want to always remember that you're going to have that initial function call. I'm not going to go over the entire media all over again, but where it cut off, we were in the really core distinction of inner functions versus outer functions. And the more I read that section, or to cap off from the end of last week, what I believe is going on, or how they're interpreting those two terms, is related to the process ID. It's not process ID. It's just the ID of the function call or the variable in relation to the UI versus the server. And you want to keep those in sync with each other. Well, we as developers don't assign those numeric values to the ID. We just have control over the functions themselves. So when the UI and the server are interchanging with each other, that space or that exchange, we're accessing those variables. And so I think the inner versus outer variable conversation is related to being able to access those IDs. So what I was talking about here is we were discussing duplicate functions. Anytime you have to write something twice, multiple times, you should probably write it as a function to just call it, and it makes your code a little bit easier to manage. You're not writing such a very large text file that things get a little bit scatterbrained. So what we did here is the difference between the UIs of slider input, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. What we did is we wrapped that same 4 lines of code into one single function, passing the variable ID. So then we call slider input, pass the ID value, and then all of the labels for it. So when we call the function, we're just saying slider ID input 0, 1, and then passing the ID label as alpha, beta, gamma, delta. It shortens the code down and doesn't make it as lengthy or difficult to manage, right? Other functions was the topic that I kept short and concise. This particular section, the topic was compiling functions into one repository to call again and again. What I believe we were discussing in this topic was branching between multiple Shiny apps, but calling on a global repository of where we have these functions located. So if we were developing multiple applications, we could call on these other functions that we've already built, these helper functions that we've already built, and just bring them into our code. Colin has talked a lot about per as a package and being able to iterate over large quantities of data instead of for loops and while loops, et cetera. We just call in the per package. Well, if we've already built this into a function call, per can aid in replicating those functions. Big things to come here by using per and using the map function. Map is what we're doing by iterating. We are iterating through a list of vectors. Note the function call slider input 01, from which in turn populates the name of the slider ID. So we've got sliders, and then we call function map, pass it the variable list that we have concatenated alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and then assign those to the other function call slider input 01. So same line of text, it's doing the same previous examples that were a little bit more extensive. Before I go further, I just wanted to clarify one comment here. If a user is comfortable with writing extensively long script files or files, mshiny app files, go ahead and do what's familiar to you. With time, with effort, this will become easier, and it will make your apps a lot simpler to maintain and more concise for other users or other maintainers, developers. Okay. We can also call UIs as data. You can use input data frame tibble, CSV files or JSON files for these UI elements. Colin, to your respect, I actually went off on a tangent. Kevin probably helped my thoughts in following this path, but I watched Bryant, what's her first name? Our developer, our engineer.
Is it Jenny?
Jenny Bryant, thank you. Jenny is her first name. I watched a YouTube video she was giving at our presentation. I think it was in 2016, but she was talking about the mapping features of per, and then was discussing a lot of these components of how you can use functions and iterate over them. So she was discussing keeping your particular naming conventions in other forms of media, like data frames and tibbles, et cetera, and then just pulling those in as a map function to populate whatever UI you were generating. Okay, let's get past this mapping feature. On the server side, so what, Kevin, I'm hoping I'm parlaying over to your presentation, but I made a comment last week that said functions are only server related or UI related. Okay, we're linking them together. Yes, I'm not contesting that comment, but functions as a call are directed at either the UI or either the server, not both. It's not until you get into the topic of modules where you're bridging the gap between those two so that your module is calling between the two or keeping everything concise. So the uploading data example that we have here, we're creating the server and then using a variable, a object, passing tools, file extension, input, and then file name. By using the switch feature, we're crossing between either a CSV file or a TSV file, tab separated variable file, and then choosing how you're going to manage or handle the initial touch point of that particular file. If it's comma separated, it's going to delimit with a comma. If it's tab separated, it would delimit with a tab instead. Okay. By changing this server function, we can just say load file function and then name and path to the file. Okay. It shortens the code base slightly. If I can, I have to zoom out a little bit. Sorry. Making it hard to read now, but what I was showing in this first initial, this call here, this first initial example where the length of the function call is fairly extensive, we can shorten it up by packaging it together in a different form. All right, and zoom back in again. A rule of thumb when working through reactive calls, avoid taking reactives as input or returning outputs. Instead, pass values into arguments and assume the caller will return the results into a reactive if needed. Colin, this expanded into your topic last week and the placement of the reactive call. The example that we were discussing, or the use case we were discussing, was you had a reference to a reactive variable, and that every time the function was called, it would reset the variable and not maintain it in a persistent memory. Were you able to test that out over this week? And don't feel obligated if you didn't.
Unfortunately not. I
Okay.
spent most of my time trying to figure out modules. So
No worries. Okay. All right. No worries. What for Connor's benefit, Kevin, Colin, and I were discussing if we were to take out that reactive call, place it external to the function itself, then the initial instantiation of that variable would maintain its placement. It wouldn't reset every time the reactive call would be made. I don't know if that actually resolves any of the conflicts that we were discussing last week or not, but this was the last topic that we had at hand. And then the last point was the internal functions. And this is where the presentation stopped, or I guess we kind of went off on a tangent talking about what was actually being discussed here. The other functions section of this chapter 18 was going off on being able to, I don't know, call your functions in multiple apps. In this internal functions call, what we were discussing was the touch points of the variables that are managed between the server and the UI. So internal calls, internal functions, we want to be able to access those variable IDs without actually knowing what the ID is. And that's kind of the reactive concept, but I'm trying to use an example here. The comment I was making last week was helping another user in JavaScript when the UI and server would spin up and start communicating. He wanted to iterate through a search function all of the tabs that he had open, and he was unable to figure out the ID of that particular tab to be able to iterate through. And I was telling him, I don't think you're applying the logic quite correctly, and that we were digging back into that search function call and exactly what it was doing. And I believe that's where this internal topic comes in, this internal function topic comes in. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. That was short and sweet, and I hope that I've added to our last week's conversation or my debacle that I had.
No, that was good. That was great. The other thing that I was looking at too, because we were also talking about when it was the section on like other applications, like we talked about like the US date picker or the US weekday input. I tried playing around a little bit with the icon radio buttons function. And to be honest, I couldn't get this example to work. So if anybody gets caught up, like I had a little bit of trouble of getting this example to work within an app. And it had something to do with the values object where it had this if else statement based on the choices. And so I was playing around with it. And so it didn't really work out, but I kind of understood what they were trying to do. It was trying to help, I think, iterate through, like they're just radio buttons that have icons attached to them. So like I just did like a smiley face, the content face, and then like a frowny face. But in trying to get that to work, there was an issue with that if else statement that it just wasn't working for me. So if anybody gets hung up with that one, I found an issue with it, but, or maybe I'm doing something wrong too. I can't remember.
You don't think it would be a package issue or a update to that package that may be breaking that if else statement, do you?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I just think it was something, I can't remember what it was. Like once I got rid of like the if else statement, it worked. Actually, no, it might have been a package update because the error that I was getting was when it was getting passed into that radio buttons function, it would say something like choice names, choice values can't be named. But the input was an object that was named. So like it was like it had like the variable, or it had the icon names within it, but then each one of those icon names had a name attached to it. And so when it got passed into the radio buttons function, like into choices name or choices values, it wouldn't take it. It would just error out. And so
I don't think that has anything to do with the vector or anything having parentheses around the naming convention of it, do you?
No,
Okay.
I don't know. I think what I just what I pinpointed down is that you can pass a vector into it, and that's what it's intended for, at least what I knew of, for like choice names and choice values. But it was an issue of if you had a vector that each one of those elements in that vector had a name attribute attached to it.
Okay.
That radio buttons function didn't accept that, and so
I
it
didn't mean
didn't. No, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to say parentheses. I meant quotes. Quotes around the name. There's there in the string R package. There's a big difference between vectors or the. Connor, I think you helped give a presentation on this topic. If I can call in your brain. There's if you pass a variable, it may require the use of quotations around it so that it knows what it's looking for versus just unquoted variables. But I may be confusing a topic there too.
Yeah, I mean, if it's saying it can't be named, and that tells me that it's expecting like a list.
Yeah.
Because vectors, maybe I'm rusty, but I don't recall vectors having names like the items in a list.
Yeah, and I may be I may be mispronouncing or misinterpreting the vector concept, but maybe it's a list. A list doesn't require quotations, but the other way it does, or it's vice versa.
It sort of depends on how you want to access it, I think.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, without digging into it too deep, just playing around with this example, like it was just an issue with what was getting passed into choice names and choice values of that radio buttons function. Beyond what was going on, I'm not sure, but that I had an issue with it, and so I couldn't totally figure out what was going on with this function. But I understood the concept, right? It was trying to create different radio buttons and apply an icon to it. So
and run the code while Kevin's presenting. I'll go grab it and see if I can get it to work or mess around with it anyway. So.
And that's why I was kind of digging around. I can't find my file that I was messing around with. So
good point. All right.
So does anybody have any other questions or comments or anything else anybody else wants to look at for this chapter?
I'm excited to try out some functions to develop UIs. So that's probably my next thing. I never thought about it before, and this
I
book
think
has opened my eyes. I'm excited about trying it.
Manages it easier. Yeah.
Because I repeat a lot of input across different apps. It's like the same thing, just different values in there, and I get tired of doing it. Because honestly, I always have to look it up how to do it. So I'm excited about trying to do a function.
I think the idea is just bringing more simplicity to your development or to your authorship. If you've already built the application, you've already built the service, you wouldn't be requiring this long list of keyboard actuating. Instead, you just call it once, here's my data, and then build everything for me. It's not more eloquent, it's just more efficient. There's other more eloquent ways of developing it, but this just brings a whole layer of efficiency to your output.
This is kind of related to like using modules, but it took me a while to get into functions. But now that I know how to do functions, I don't like writing long scripts at all. I like everything's got to be a function. I've moved to that. I've shifted to that perspective of just make it a function, and it makes it a lot easier. Instead of these long, I used to have these long R scripts, and now I've kind of disciplined myself to move over to functions, and I'm much happier.
Same thing for me, for sure.
Right. I'm going to stop sharing, Kevin, if unless anybody has anything else.
So Kevin, I think we'll just switch over to you. So whenever you're ready.
Sure. So I'm going to nip this real quick. speaking of that, so we were already touching on the motivation for doing modules. But the learning objectives for tonight are to go over the motivation really quick and the structure of a module. I was reviewing the previous group's video and they jumped right into goal maps, which I love, of course, but I think what would benefit us was to break down the structure of a module rather than going through those concepts, because I know we can all read, but it's pretty dense. And I think you have to apply the structure of a module to, to get the meat of it. You just have to look at modules and play with them. So that's my game plan for tonight is to really just break it down of what everything is doing. And then maybe next week we can look at some goal maps and apps that use modules, because I think that's what you have to use. So I just wanted to show you, this is one thing I'm pretty proud of. This is a home. Usually my home apps are pretty messy, the homepage of an app that I have. So, and right here, I'm just using sub modules within another module. And so this gets messy, like different links. It's got a bunch of info boxes in here of links to data forms that they need to complete, the program objectives, and then the data entry counts. And typically on my apps, this gets really messy, especially all the different boxes. And so this is much cleaner. And if there's an issue, and if I need to update something, I can go to that module without, I know exactly where to go to fix it up. And it just blends right in. So that kind of goes back to the using functions to work. And do you know what issue I had with this? It took me about an hour, but I was forgetting, and we'll talk about this. I was forgetting to put the NS in here.
Namespace.
And that's
right?
the namespace.
Yep.
And what happens is you don't get an error. It just draws blank, which is really frustrating. So a nice Stack Overflow post
By the way,
help me
Kevin,
out.
in the development console of your browser, does it show any error when you don't have the namespace called out? Like normally at the bottom, you'll get warnings and just broken, ugly red text.
I don't remember the error code from the
Okay.
console, but I think maybe here's what I think it said, if I remember right. There's no reactive context. And I went, what the heck? And but then I saw just this Google search on sub modules, and then it was just, you forgot the NS, and I'm like, oh, I did too. Can't believe I did it. But actually, that's a very common thing when you're using modules, is to forget the NS. So do that. I guess I may be going back and forth. Let me share. Okay, so like I said, modules are kind of miniature apps within the larger app. They isolate a particular group of inputs and outputs. And so kind of like I was showing you there, they just fit in like a puzzle piece to the bigger app, to the bigger portion of it. And like I said, it makes your Shiny code easier to debug and reusable. So let's go over the structure of a module and just go through the pieces of it. And then we'll apply it to the applications that are in the book or that they laid out already. So when you run a snippet of Shiny mod, this is what pops up. And in my version, I don't know if this is common, but they do a shortcut right here. The NS is the namespace. And we'll come back to that later. And the tag list is just it's a list of items of inputs that you can use. And so right here, you're not necessarily using your fluid page or your column layout. You're going to do that in your bigger app. And that's one takeaway that I learned. I always wondered what the heck this tag list was in there for. And now I know. The previous cohort had an item about Golem. Golem does it a little bit different, but we'll come back to that when we look at the examples, if you wish. Does anyone have any questions about this structure?
Yeah, so I just have a comment. Like, I know later on in the chapter it talks about like the snippet. So the snippet in the book is different than what the default is in like, and maybe it's just because my RStudio hasn't been updated, but in the newer one in the book, they get rid of that NS or assigning that NS, that small NS to the NS ID. And they also had some different naming conventions too. And this just could be just Hadley's way of doing it since he wrote the book.
Which version are you using?
For the book or for RStudio?
What RStudio do you have?
Let me see. That's a good question.
Because I was wondering about that. I noticed that when I did it.
Because one of the exercises has you open up your snippets and then like, so I have 1.4.1717, which was out May 24th. So May 24th of 2021.
That's, I don't know.
Well, it was different. Like it was different from the book because I opened it up and I looked at the snippets too, and it was slightly different. And, you know, in Hadley's book, he gets rid of the NS, the small NS, lowercase with the upper NS ID. And I don't know if that was by design or, you know.
I think this is a shortcut. This makes it easier, in my opinion. This is how Golem does it. So I'm more familiar with it. And when we go through the applications, I'll show you what it looks like without it. Yeah, I noticed that. I was like, well, I'm not going to change it. This is what my RStudio popped up as.
No, I say stick with it. Yeah, stick with it. I was just pointing that out because I saw that and I was like, it's a little bit different than what the book was talking about. But I mean, if Golem uses it and you're comfortable with it, go with it. So,
well, this is my default. I was surprised when I did it, when that opened up, because and I'm just using R4.1. I don't know what I don't remember what RStudio version I'm using, but I just did that this morning. But it's actually easier if you just have the NS and just have that little cheater thing. Because the NS it's easy, but easy to forget about. So the previous cohort had this. This is just a basic application with a histogram using the cards data set. And when we use a module, we are naming it histogram UI. We're going to do the UI first, and we're just wrapping it in that function call. And then the tag list. So if you notice, we're not using column or fluid row or anything like that. We're using, and then, excuse me, just using just basically the inputs and outputs. So right here, you have your select input, and notice how he has the NS ID. You have to have that. That defines the namespace. And then the rest of this is just normal inputs and then your output calls. When we get down here, here's your server. And this is new, this module server, because it used to be call module. And so that just wraps it in. And then you have your normal data reactive to your cars data set, your histogram. Is there any questions? So now when we're just going to wrap this up into an app. And we have the histogram app. We're calling the function. We're wrapping it in the function. We have, now we're using our fluid page, like our normal app call. And you're calling histogram hist1. And then down here, histogram server hist1. Now, let me go back to my R session right here, because I had a takeaway. And this may be obvious, but when we're down here, let me run this. Make sure histogram. See how this hist1? My question was, where does that hist1 come from? And so if you go run, whoops, I don't know what library is called. What? Whoops. Okay. So I want to run app. Run that. So that runs, right? So this argument is arbitrary. If you want to make it hist99, oops, yeah, escape. So it runs again, but these two have to match.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. Is it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's just they have to match.
I, for the life of me, could not figure that out for the longest time.
Well, could you use Kevin in both places and it would still run without any error, correct? As long as they match, as long as the two variables.
But if I make this hist1, it won't let me do a run app. So now just the top part ran and the histogram did not. And for the longest time, I could not figure this out. When I was looking at when I was trying to learn modules without Golem, I couldn't figure it out. I didn't understand where this hist1 was coming from, but I realized it's just an argument and you're defining the argument. But as long as they match.
This just implies that your UI is rendering, but there's no relation to the server. There's nothing that connects to the server. There's no relationship between the two, right? Because the names don't match.
Yes.
Well, I think because I was thinking about that too, because that kind of goes back to like first parts of the chapter too. Like your application's going to still render and run, And because it's lazy, it's going to still process it. But since you don't have that server connection, it's still going to run, but it's not going to output anything because you don't have that connection, which I thought was kind of interesting too. Then the other thing that I was thinking with this as well was, it wasn't really clear to me, and this might be clarified by the use of Golem because I haven't really used it. My first question was like, where do I stick these? Like, yeah, it's great. We're talking about modules, but where do you stick them? Like, that was what was tripping me up. Like when I first read the chapter, I was like, that's great. I understand the concepts here, but where do I put it? And so in my mind, in my mental model, and somebody correct me, people who have more experience with modules, is I just put them into their own R file, put them into the R file and put them into their own R script, and then had those three like UI, server, and then application. And it worked for me. So I don't know if there's another place that you put them or if there's another convention that I should be following, but that's what I came down to.
Well, that's why, I can see some people may criticize Golem for being a little bit too much, and sometimes it feels like it is, but I like it. I like the structure, the file structure for it. So yeah, it falls in the R the R directory, your modules.
Well, I think it's step number 2, if I'm not mistaken, Kevin, that renders it. I think it asks you, do you have any modules that you want to include? And you can list out what you have. To your benefit, Colin, the reason it probably worked is because you just happened to put it in the right folder. But if a person that weren't using Golem and they placed it in some other weird location on their hard drive or somewhere in the parent directory, and the application didn't know how to access it, that's where you violate that namespace concept. If it doesn't know where to look for where the functions are located, you're never going to get anything to operate. Using Golem, I don't want to use the word forces, it requires you to put them, or it manages the placement of those modules in the location that it's going to access. It kind of doesn't dumbify, it just makes it simpler of where those particular scripts run or those modules run. It manages or puts that all there for you. You don't really have to think about it, it just works. And the other, I guess, comparable concept here would be the here package, right? I don't really know where in all of these 20,000 files that I have in my app where this one particular call is made. I just know that it works. Well, the reason it works is because it knows the location of where that's stored at. It's managing where that location is.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking is like, well, because I mean, like it's just like a package, right? Anything that's in your R folder will be put into the environment to use. And so that's why I was thinking it's the same thing with an application with functions, right? Is if you put your functions in the R file, they should be put into the environment once the application kicks off. And so, and I think with Golem, from what I know of Golem, it's an opinionated framework that, it puts things in places so that things work. And so is it in Golem? Does it just dump it into an R folder or does it put it somewhere else?
Puts it in an R folder. Yeah, it is. And it frames that you're going to make it into a package, an R package, which is really helpful. I'm trying to think.
So it's following the same convention. Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah. No, and here's the thing, the good and bad of it is it names your modules for you. Like you put in a name and then it will paste in some conventions. And then it'll tell you, okay, copy this into your UI, copy this into your server, and it names it. Like if you name it, it will be something like this. Mod hist. There may not be an underscore on the hist one. So mod. It'll be something like that. It'll name it for you, and then you just copy and paste it into your server, which was kind of a blessing at first because you can get things working. But I had a hard time with just modules without in the Golem framework.
And then the last comment that I had too, like if you look at the NS function, so like if you just look at NS in isolation, it takes in two arguments. It takes in a namespace argument and an ID argument. And so if you go back into your console and you stop your application and you run that NS function where you give like a namespace name and an ID name, and you run that, your output, all it is just a character putting those two things together. So that was one thing that blew my mind with NS, is that it's kind of like, there's probably more happening in the background. It's kind of like, you know, paste 0 or paste. It's just putting two like string things together to manage that namespace. And so when I watched a video about that one time, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense of what that's doing. It's helping you manage that because that's what NS is doing. But
And so I also think with these argument calls that if for some reason you wanted to put this somewhere else in your app, in the same app, I think you could go histogram UI his2. If you had like another page or a tab panel, I think that's what it would allow you to do, because the ultimate one of the benefits of using modules is to like have if you had a select input thing, and then it could cross modules and talk to different modules. So I think I think you'd be allowed to do that, but I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the value. That's what your namespace is doing. I think it was originally 1.
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but one of the first exercises that are coming up, it asks you to repeat it, and it does the same thing. And one thing that I found out is that you could use a map function to create those numbers. So do like hist1, hist2, hist3, hist4, and it really condenses down the code. And it also gives you flexibility to really expand it. So if you wanted 10 inputs, you could go like map 1 through 10, and then I was blown away when I saw that. When we get there, I can share my code, but I was like, wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. No. All right. So we're a little bit going a little bit quicker than I thought, but because this next part is really tricky for me. And I have reread the communication between modules, and I have reread this book so many times, and I was looking for that specific item to learn how to do this better, because on one of my older apps, I did a input that crossed the modules. And I ripped some old code, just copied it, just took another example and applied it to my own using the call module. And I couldn't do it in a new one. And I'm like, oh, I can't figure this out. But I decided to kind of go away from that. But Hadley mentions you can build a dashboard, just do modules that you can still use modules without having the data talk to each other. But it's fun to be able to do it. And I was really struggling with that. And I think I have finally found in here where it gives an example of how to do that. So I was excited to finally, I have parsed over this book and I couldn't make the connection to it, but I think this section has it. Are there any questions? Concerns? Okay, so we're gonna go through this example and we're gonna apply how it communicates. It's how it's using the select input to go across modules to be able to use it. So I'm gonna run this. So let's see. I also got caught up in this, trying to understand this better. And then I'm like, okay, it's not the focus, not the focus. do package. So right here, you see where I'm pointing at. This is really important. This lets you pass the data through the different modules. So if we are, and if you notice there are some arguments here, the data chosen, we're using our app has become more complex, and we're using some arguments within the select var server here. Trying to remember. Does that run the app? I don't think so. And so now we're coming back over here. The one thing I'm not sure about is this react, where this histogram argument's coming from. That's the only thing I don't understand what's happening here. And if anyone knows, let me know. But this is how to grab the data. This is still not all the way through. So now you have another module, and then right in here, you're having to call that data again. I may need to come back to this next week to go over it again.
No, that's cool too, Kevin.
To break it down, a little bit more, I feel like I need a chart, a diagram of where it's at. So you have, I lost my place a little bit. Okay, so we have our input variable or module. You have the data set server. This right here is just a helper function. Now we have our select variable module right in here. But this is a really important point to be able to use this data later in the app. So it ties together. You're tying it together right here. Or that's a part of it. So now the histogram output is just pretty not too much happening there. It's pretty self-explanatory. Histogram server. And then the app. And then right here, you're bringing that down into data servers. I'm sorry, I lost my place a little bit.
No, I think this is good. The one thing, and if I could just jump in here real quick, the one thing that I thought the book in this reading that kind of made it a little confusing is when Hadley decided to change this idea from like, okay, in a really simple example, we were having UI and server, and then he decided to say, well, now you can have this naming convention of inputs and outputs. And then that's where I got really confused, because I was like, well, they're kind of doing the same thing, but now you're changing your naming scheme, which it's fine to be a little bit more complex. But when he did that, I got confused, because I was like, okay, now you're talking about inputs and outputs, input of what, output of what. And so, and when I was kind of looking through your code, that's where I was kind of like getting lost too, was like, Okay, what do you mean input to what, output to what? Does that mean it's an input into the module? Or are we talking, you know, so I just got kind of confused with that. That was more of a comment than a question, but
Where's the histogram output? Did I miss it? Thing. Then that should work. Then that works. Well, I was feeling good about explaining that. Like, okay,
No,
on Sunday, but I want to diagram that out because it's so important. Because that's the tricky part of modules, is tying that to where the data set and the bins can all kind of work together. It's such an important concept.
no, I think I see what's going on here. So if you notice on the title of the plot itself on your right, drop down the variable and change that to some other name. Because it's a reactive call, yeah, so then it's going to change the title. So we're putting a placeholder there for the title of the plot. And it just so happens to be the histogram is the name of the I don't want to use the word variable again. I've used that too many times, but it's the name of the object. So by using that variable drop-down menu, looking at your data set, choosing that naming convention, and then updating from that reactive call, it's changing the plot title. I could be just reiterating something very obvious, but I think that's where the statement on that comment says it's a little bit frivolous to put that title there. The title is a bit frivolous, but it's going to motivate an important technique very shortly. Note the default value of title. It has to be reactive, so we need to wrap constant value inside of a reactive call. So we're looking at the UI, dropping down the menu of variable, selecting whatever we want to call it, and then that's what it outputs. Now, I don't know what the bracket 10 is doing. I'm not sure. Oh, maybe that's the bins. Maybe it's
yeah, that is the bins.
The number of bins together. Okay. And that would be a reactive as well, correct?
Yes. So look right here, see in the list, pairs they want, and then input, I guess, where's the bins? Let's get rid of that. Output, render plot, main, paste, title, input, bins. There. Does anyone know what the title reactive histogram? Where that's
Don't
can you do?
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was just thinking, could you just do like a control F and see if you can find that object histogram? I mean, that's like the quickest way I could think.
I think Ryan's right. I think it is just a placeholder. I think it's updated as soon as there's an input.
oh,
It's
If you remember
overwritten.
Sorry, Colin, or Connor, if I recall correctly, if you don't initialize a reactive call, you're going to get an error out. So in this place, we're just calling it whatever we want. In this case, it happens to be the name histogram, but that doesn't actually get printed to the screen. That's just the initial entry point of whatever. I don't know, change it to plot and see if it errors out the code. I don't think it would. Because you have to initialize the reactive. If not, it'll pass back an error. Colin, I think that was one of your topics, wasn't it? In the discussion of reactives, there was like 4 chapters on that topic alone. And I recall one of the things that sticks in my head is that if you don't initialize the reactive call and when you start the server, it's going to give you an error on the output. the whole system will come crashing down.
I'll try it without it. I guess it'd probably just, even if we went like that, it would probably still just be null. Yeah. You can just leave it blank. But I think there has to be something there. Even that's something. Nothing is something.
Yeah, if you pass it to empty parentheses or like null, I bet it would.
Error
Yeah.
out. Let's see. Huh.
No? I don't know what it does then.
But that example is really important when you want to use that input, those passing data across your modules, because it took me forever to kind of realize that's what he was. I was like, why are there no examples? I wish it was a little bit more explicit that this is what this is doing. It kind of leaves some assumptions, but
Well, we're about 6:57, so maybe this is a good place to kind of pause, and maybe we can come back to this example next time, and we all could kind of let it kind of marinate for a little bit and go from there.
I would say the previous cohort linked to some examples that are really excellent. At least I found the Golem app was just really great. There's some examples exactly what I'm talking about, using a select input to go across your modules and pass data across, or to be able to use it. I thought it was just fantastic. If you clone it, I'll just say you need to change the, there's some, let me know if you run into trouble running it, if you clone it to your local machine. He's got the working directory set to his own personal thing. So you got to change some directory items, but after that it works. And the Golem version, he's got it at 3.91, and I couldn't get it to run because I had a different version. I just changed it a little bit. So there's some housekeeping you have to do. But if you want to look at the app, but that's mostly if you want to clone it and run it, there's some housekeeping you have to do to get it to work. But it's a really good app, good example app of how things work across.
Cool. Any other comments or questions for Kevin?
No, that was a pretty good walkthrough. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was great.
Hope that helps. It's a tough topic.
Yeah, and I think, well, the one thing when I was reading the chapter, they link, I think it was like the first section, like motivation. They have that video. I can't remember the person's name. I have it right here, Eric Nance. He also does like the Shiny Dev podcast. If you watch that video of his like talk on our studio conference 2019, he's like, it takes practice. It's not one of those things that you're going to, I think he called it the shiny I think his like analogy was like the shiny module road. Like it's going to take, it's going to be a path that you have to go down, and it's not going to be an easy path. So, but it obviously, Kevin, with your examples that you shared tonight and your explanation of it, I think we can see the utility and the importance. So I think we can continue this conversation next time and finish that up. So I guess we were discussing I think we decided that we're going to go the 29th. I think is there anybody that has, or is anybody in objection of that, or are we still good to go the 29th? Okay, cool. I guess, and if something does come up, just post it on Slack. But yeah, with that, that's all we have. So I got to jump off here at 7, but you guys are more than welcome to continue the conversation. But again, Kevin, I really appreciate your time, and I'll see everybody next week.
All right. Take care.
I'll see everyone.
Thanks, everyone.